whole of Indian Territory has been swallowed up by the white man, but many black men helped with the swallowing. Many black men helped with the swallowing. And indeed, Langston, the area of Langston City and central Oklahoma would be considered a promised land for a long time. How many of you have heard of Langston University? A few people. African Americans often know about Langston University. It's the largest and oldest and most prestigious black college in Oklahoma. It was founded by Edwin McCabe. And it was founded for Langston City, and it was founded as a way of trying to get African Americans to come to that area of central Oklahoma. Understand that there were African Americans by the thousands who would come to Oklahoma, and many of them would be successful. Indeed, by 1900, there would be 50,000 African American farmers in the Oklahoma Territory. 50,000 African American farmers. Most of these people were obviously homesteaders. Most of these people had participated in the various runs. They were very proud of the property that they had acquired. They were very proud of the communities that they established. This is the black store owner in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory. Oklahoma didn't come anywhere near to being a black state, but it did offer for one brief moment, the possibility of economic opportunity and political freedom. Unfortunately, that brief moment ended in 1907. That was the year that the twin territories of Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory combined and became the state of Oklahoma. The Democrats, not that I have anything against Democrats, okay, but the Democrats completely controlled or completely dominated the state legislature, and they did two things. Number one, they passed a whole series of laws to restrict black voting in Oklahoma. And number two, they passed a whole series of laws that would discriminate against blacks in the social and economic realm. In other words, they created, if you will, an Oklahoma that looked increasingly like the South, more like the South than the West of McCabe's dream. More like the South than the West of McCabe's dream. Let me talk about one other area of homesteading. I know we're running behind in time, but I want to talk about one other area of homesteading because it's very close to home. The area that I want to mention is Deer Lake, Washington, 1906. How many of you from Spokane are familiar with Spokane? Oh, okay. Deer Lake, as you know, is a very trendy area. The Kirkendalls know this is a very, very trendy area. In the 1890s, there was a considerable effort to try to create a predominantly black agricultural colony in Deer Lake. And the driving force behind this was Reverend Peter Barrow Sr., who was a Vicksburg minister who was part of what I call the refugees out of the South into the West. He was driven out of Mississippi by the Reconstruction process, or the failure of Reconstruction, and he worked his way across the West and eventually ended up in Spokane. And he created Calvary Baptist Church in Spokane. And if you guys ever drive the freeway, I-90, you'll go right past the church. It's still right off the freeway. What you also may or may not know is that was the church home for Ron Sims, our own Ron Sims. He grew up in that church. But Reverend Barrow is important to us because he would try to establish a colony at Deer Lake. He died in 1900, and his son took over the project, and eventually the colony was going to be established, and it would run for a while. This is what the son wrote. Deer Lake will establish a place where a demonstration of the possibilities of the colored farmhand can be made. In this enterprise, we've decided to go back to the soil. I won't go through all of this, but then at the end, he talks about becoming part of the great development work that's going on. What he means by that is the great development work of Tuskegee Institute and Booker T. Washington. In other words, African Americans, even in Spokane, African Americans, even in Washington, the state of Washington, were part of this process of homesteading land and looking to the rural areas of the states and the territories for opportunity. And some of them did succeed. Some of them did become successful. Jonas Groves was the potato king. Remarkable story. He settled in Kansas. What do I say? How can I collapse this story? Groves arrives in Kansas from Ohio with $1.25 in his pocket. This is the typical Horatio Algier story. And he essentially decides to turn himself to work. He works for what he calls starvation wages. And eventually he builds up his resources and he begins to buy land. As a matter of fact, I want to read his statement. By keeping my eyes open, always attending to duty, and doing more rather than less than was required of me, I soon succeeded in having my wages raised to 75 cents a day. This was considered a fair price, and I was on the road to fortune. Well, let me explain what that fortune would be. 28 years after he made that statement, in 1907, he was reputedly, Jonas Groves was reputedly, the world's largest grower of Irish potatoes. He had amassed holdings, land holdings, that amounted to 40 square miles in 3 Kansas counties. He and his wife, Matilda, and their 12 children lived, and you can see the house over there, lived in a 22-room brick home, complete with electric lights, 2 telephones, and hot and cold running water in all of the bathrooms. This was extremely unusual in 1906, guys. This was almost unheard of, especially in a rural area. But Jonas Groves was one of those examples of prosperity on the western frontier. The other example, and I'll do this quickly, is Robert Ball Anderson of Box Butte County, Nebraska. Robert Ball Anderson pretty well duplicates Groves' success, although he doesn't own as much land. Eventually, though, he will own about 3,000 acres in Nebraska, which makes him the largest African-American landowner in the state. And he talks about his life and his success. He says in an autobiography, and I'm reading only part of this, I am old now, and I can't do much work, but I have a good farm and money in the bank to tide me over in my old age. I am a rich man today, or at least rich enough for my own needs. Folks, these are examples of opportunity. These are examples of the promise of the West. Yes, that promise was compromised. There's no question that there were those who were going to try to restrict black rights. There's no question that there were those who were going to try to deny opportunity. But at the same time, African Americans, as always would be the case, would make a way when there was no way. They would open up opportunities when it appeared that none existed, and they would, in the process, completely transform the various areas of the West. This is the fun part for me. Let me just make a small caveat. I started work on African Americans in the West about 30 years ago. Many of you know that. And it amazed me that for the longest time, and maybe even to this day, there were those who assumed that when we meant blacks in the West, we were talking about cowboys. And I won't give you all the examples of how this has come down, but let me suggest to you that cowboys are part of the story, but they're only a small part of the story. Nonetheless, I want to acknowledge that the cowboys existed, that they were in and of the West. And the other group that I want to talk about, and I think I'll spend a little bit more time on them tonight, are the Buffalo Soldiers, because for a couple of reasons. Number one, because there were far more of them. But number two, because since they work for the federal government, we have far better records. So we know a lot more about the Buffalo Soldiers than we know about the Cowboys. But as I suggest, the Cowboys and the Buffalo Soldiers are kind of iconic groups in terms of the African American West. They are the groups that everybody sort of notices. And one of the things that I'll say about the Black Cowboys is that, unfortunately, there were relatively few of them, that they were not nearly as numerous as the images that have been projected over the years. Indeed, when people started talking about the Black West in the 1960s and 1970s, they almost invariably talked about cowboys. And yet the cowboys are not, at least to my estimation, the most important aspect of the Black Western experience. And we've talked about some of this before, and we're going to talk about other aspects of that experience. One of the reasons for this is because the cowboys were relatively small in number. The cowboys were relatively small in number. And what I mean by this is not just African American cowboys, but cowboys in general. Let me give you some statistics that indicate this. According to the U.S. Census of 1890, there were 61,000 ranchers, herders, and drovers in the entire area of the West, the entire area that we've been discussing. They comprise only 2% of the 3 million workers in the western states and territories. Now, there's a disconnect here. I mean, our image of the West, yes, our image of the West is that it's a place that's full of cowboys, and yet the statistics, if the Census Bureau is to be believed, simply doesn't bear this out. And I always thought about, the problem of the image as opposed to the reality. And I realized, as I was doing my own research, that, for instance, Virginia City and the area around Virginia City, Nevada, had far more miners, and indeed even had far more clerks than it did cowboys or cattlemen. And yet, I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember Bonanza, are you not? Okay. You remember Bonanza. And I always imagine, what would Bonanza have been like if the story revolved around a clerk in Virginia City? It just doesn't work. It just really doesn't work. You have to have this image of the large and powerful rancher and the cowboys and all the rest, High Chaparral, Big Valley, Bonanza. They're all very, very powerful images, but do they reflect the reality? According to the census, they don't. That the vast majority of the people were not engaged in this business. Of those who were African American, of the 61,000 who were engaged in the range cattle industry, only 1,600 in 1890 were black. Compare this to the fact that there were 900,000 farmers in the West, including 75,000 African Americans. And when you see these figures, then you have to put in perspective this whole idea of the cowboys. Nonetheless, the census figures do reflect the fact that the cowboys existed in every state and territory in the West, including right here in Washington, and certainly in eastern Washington. Moreover, one of the things that I found in my own research, and others who came before me, was that the image that we have of the West as a place where the cowboys were almost always white, and that was an image, of course, that was projected by Hollywood for so many years, was simply not the case, was simply not true. Indeed, the cowboys represented, if you will, very much of a multicultural workforce, far more multicultural than other aspects of the Western economy. And let me go to the next slide. And this is kind of an ironic slide. This is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a cowboy himself. He was a ranch owner in the West. And here he is talking about cowboys of color. Now, he didn't use that term, but he's talking about the various people that worked with him. And notice what is going on here, beside Theodore Roosevelt's obvious racism, but understand what's going on. He's talking about people of various ethnicities. In South Dakota, where Theodore Roosevelt was ranching in the 1880s, there were Chicanos, there were Indians, and there were black cowboys. And if that's the case in South Dakota, imagine what it's like on the cattle frontier in the rest of the region. Indeed, one of the problems that we have in terms of discussing the cowboys is that we really, well, how will I put this? Cowboys, for the most part, didn't write. And because they didn't write, and because no one wrote for them or wrote about them, we have relatively scant material in which we can put together to try to find out about their lives. And as a result, we end up with snippets. As a result, we end up with bits and pieces of information from all across the board. But there are enough of those bits and pieces of information to begin to paint a picture about African American cowboys, and that's what I want to talk about rather briefly tonight. Those cowboys, as I said before, did exist, and some of them became noted. For example, Mississippi-born slave, he was born a slave, Bose Icard, was lifted from anonymity by the praise that was given to him by his employer, a very famous Texas cattleman named Charles Goodnight. You may know Charles Goodnight as the guy who founded the Goodnight Loving Trail in the West. And notice what he says about Icard. He suggests that Icard is his best worker. And these kinds of tributes were not uncommon throughout the West. Yes, there were relatively few cowboys, but those cowboys who did exist tended to win praise of their employers more times than not. I should add as a caveat that we believe that most people who've seen the film or the series Lonesome Dove believe that Danny Glover's character was based on Bose Icard, a real black cowboy. Let me talk about another African-American cowboy who actually challenges the myth or the stereotype in a variety of ways. His name is D.W. or Daniel Webster 80 John Wallace, and he's a cowboy who becomes a rancher. Most cowboys would remain cowboys all their lives. They would remain poor. But some cowboys crossed the line. Some were able to accumulate resources and buy land. And D.W. Wallace was one of those. As a matter of fact, there is very little in his life, his early life, that would suggest anything that would happen to him later. He was born a free man in 1860. He was not born a slave, but he was born near Inez, Texas, and he started out as a cowboy. And as a cowboy, he had the fate of many of the other cowboys. And you can see, this is one of the reasons why he's interesting. You can see he left an interview that talks about the situation in the West. He described his life on the cattle frontier, but he also would, by 1900, begin to accumulate land, and ultimately, he would have a 10,000-acre ranch in West Texas, and he would become one of the most successful ranchers in the entire state. The question that is often raised, and certainly the question that I've tried to raise, and I think I've answered it, is did the black cowboys face discrimination? After all, they worked mostly in Texas, which was very much Southern in culture as much as it was Western. They, in many instances, had been slaves before the Civil War, and we talked about the fact that we believe that the majority of black cowboys, or excuse me, the majority of cowboys in Texas in the 1850s were in fact slaves, and yet they were involved in a rapidly expanding and, if I might add, a rapidly whitening range cattle industry in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. In other words, the number of black cowboys didn't go up significantly, but the number of whites involved in the range cattle industry increased dramatically, and as a result, the percentage of blacks in that group got smaller and smaller. But one of the things that I've noted here is that it seems there was very little racial discrimination directed against black cowboys. First of all, they got equal pay for equal work, which was extremely unusual. Very seldom did blacks have equal pay for the kind of work that they did alongside whites. Secondly, for what we can gather, most of the cowboys tended to exist under the most difficult circumstances. That is, they lived out in the open, they slept on the ground, and black cowboys experienced the same ground as white cowboys. And so there was clearly very little discrimination there. But the real telltale example is what happens when they go to town, because town is a settled environment. Town is the place where customs and mores exist that could challenge notions of racial egalitarianism that are found out on the plains. And from what we've gathered, most of the black cowboys who came to towns like Dodge City ended up being treated fairly equally. That is, they were not discriminated. We have very few examples of their discrimination. In fact, one of the examples I'm going to give you is a kind of a negative example. That is, it's an example of a situation when someone attempts to discriminate against a black cowboy. An African-American, a Texas African-American, comes up on the trail in 1878. He arrives in Dodge City, and of course Dodge City, as you know, is one of the most famous of the cattle towns from that era. And he tries to check into the Dodge House, which is the leading hotel in Dodge City. And the clerk says, "We have no rooms. We have no rooms." And of course, black folks have heard that line a lot of times. The cowboy, according to the clerk, and this is the clerk telling the story, okay, but telling it years later. According to the clerk, the cowboy pulls out, and I want to quote here, "the longest barrel 6-shooter that I've ever seen in my life," and he waved it in my face and said, "You're a liar." And the clerk at that time found a room for this black cowboy. Now, I don't suggest that this is the way to deal with discrimination all the time. It's certainly not by the day's standards. But the very fact that the clerk can recall this, and the very fact that this is the way in which a potential example of discrimination was dismissed, suggests that the cowboys indeed were treated with a kind of a rough equality. And indeed, one of the things that I found, and I want to go to the next slide, one of the things that I found was that whereas for us in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, there was this grand discovery of black cowboys as if, we had never known they existed before. And of course, a lot of us didn't because we grew up with the Hollywood images of cowboys. In point of fact, Westerners, regardless of their racial background in the 1880s and 1890s, assumed that there would be black cowboys. And they assumed that that would be part of the natural order of things. that indeed it wasn't unusual for there to be black cowboys or Latino cowboys, or, you'll love this, Indian cowboys. Indian cowboys. Yes, there were Indians who worked throughout the range cattle industry as well. The quote that you see up on the wall is about, up on the screen is about Lawson Fleetwell, and I won't read to you all of it, but notice the second paragraph. Very interesting because here there's sort of a disparaging account of the cowboys, but not black cowboys, but the cowboys in general. By the way, the two images, the image at the top is of a black and a Latino cowboy working in Texas along the Rio Grande. The image at the bottom, to show you that cowboys existed everywhere, is a black cook on a trail drive in Montana. In other words, the blacks were all over the West engaged in this kind of activity. Let me leave you with one example of an outgrowth of the range cattle industry, and that was the rodeo. And of course, we all know about the rodeos that evolved in this area of the country, the most famous being the Pendleton Roundup. I know you're all familiar with the Pendleton Roundup. What you're probably not familiar with is the fact that 2 of the 6 cowboys who established the Pendleton Roundup in 1906 were African American. That is, they were black cowboys from Eastern Oregon. And the most famous of the cowboy stars, or the rodeo stars of that time period, was George Fletcher. I had the distinct honor of interviewing Mr. Fletcher, unfortunately, when he was in a nursing home, and only months before he died in 1975. But he was a remarkable man. He was a legend in Pendleton. Everyone respected him because of his abilities, particularly, and I won't get into all of these stories, but particularly because some people have felt that he had been cheated out of his just due in terms of the accolades that had come to rodeo stars. The other person I will mention just in passing is Tracy Thompson, who's another star from Pocatello, Idaho. I want you to make a connection, a local connection. How many of you are familiar with President Les Pierce of Evergreen College? A few people. That's his grandfather. That's his grandfather. Les Pierce is, of course, very intellectual, very erudite. He's far removed from the image here, but Tracy Thompson was a very famous rodeo star in Idaho and much of the interior West. Let me change our focus. Let me shift our direction in the time remaining to the other group that, as I said, will become iconic in the West, and these were the Buffalo Soldiers. And we have a lot more information about them, and as I said, there are a lot more of them. They were the approximately 25,000 men who served in 4 regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry, between roughly 1866 and 1910. They remain steeped in history and controversy, as you're going to see in a minute. The Buffalo Soldiers were, certainly in the 1990s, and I think still are, the subjects of novels, documentaries, television episodes. I think some of you may remember the very famous, although still controversial, Danny Glover movie in 1999 called Buffalo Soldiers. Yet, long before the rest of the nation recognized the Buffalo Soldiers, the 19th and 20th century African Americans saw them as heroes. 19th and 20th century African Americans saw them as heroes. Indeed, those African Americans derived considerable pride from these soldiers' role as the, quote, sable arm of the government of the United States. Carter G. Woodson, who we're all going to celebrate next month as the father of Negro history, or the father of Black History Month, described the Buffalo Soldiers as, quote, the only hero that we Negroes had when we were growing up. The only heroes that we Negroes had when we were growing up. And I would submit that some African-American soldiers eagerly embraced their role as heroes and eagerly embraced the image that they were part of the making of the West. Listen to the words of 10th Cavalry Private Henry McCombs in 1900. We made the West. We defeated the hostile tribes of Indians, and we made the country safe to live in. And it sounds like something that any federal soldier would write or say at that particular period of time. And indeed, the first generation of historians who look at the Buffalo Soldiers tend to follow that line. They tend to talk about the fact that the Buffalo Soldiers were heroic, that the Buffalo Soldiers were people who would help to conquer the frontier and make the frontier or make those areas safe for ultimate white settlement. But by the 1980s, there were new images that were coming forward. certainly there were Native American historians who were beginning to question the role of Buffalo Soldiers. Indeed, they argue that there's a moral dilemma posed by these Buffalo Soldiers because these are black men who are killing red men for white men. In other words, they are people who are engaged in the subjugation of another people, and the reward is not even land, is not even, and certainly, as you're going to see in a minute, not very much respect on the part of those for whom they were defending. In recent years, Native American people and scholars have even gone farther in terms of their critique of the Buffalo Soldiers and in terms of some of the popular images that are being presented about Buffalo Soldiers. 1994, let's fast forward to 1994. The US Post Office decides to issue a Buffalo Soldier commemorative stamp. Representatives of the Native American movement, AIM, or the American Indian movement, I'm sorry, AIM, are livid. They are upset because they argue that this is a glorification of men who killed Indians, who killed men, Indian women, Indian men, Indian children. Indeed, in 1999, when an African-American correspondent from the Baltimore Sun visited Wounded Knee, he went to the cemetery and he encountered a Lakota woman and he attempted to interview her. She said to him, and I'm quoting here, Buffalo soldiers and the white man killed my people. My ancestors are up there and I don't appreciate you being here. Why don't you go look at Abraham Lincoln's grave? Well, I would submit to you that this is, as I said, the kind of controversy that's been evolving about Buffalo Soldiers. I've been involved in debates or discussions, I like to think of them as discussions more than debates, about the role and the image of Buffalo Soldiers vis-a-vis Native Americans. But the relationship between Buffalo Soldiers and Native Americans is extremely complex, and it's a relationship that historians are only now beginning to fully understand and comprehend. If the legacy of the Buffalo Soldier is enveloped in controversy, their origin is beyond dispute. After the Civil War, the US Army was quickly reduced from 1.5 million soldiers to its pre-war total of 16,000. And in the process, the Army was reorganized to create new units that were going to fight mainly in the West, because that's where the frontier was, and that's where it seems that the difficulty was. Black soldiers were going to be part of those 4 units that I mentioned before, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry. And as a result, blacks would eventually become, technically, 10% of the Army of the United States in the West. In many instances, because of desertions or because of low staffing in the other units, blacks would actually comprise 15 to 20%. And in some areas of the West, they would be the majority of the Buffalo Soldiers. The first men who enlisted in the cavalry and the infantry units, that is the black units, were mostly 18 and 19-year-olds. They were too young to have seen service in the Civil War in 1866 or 1867. They had fairly simple reasons for joining, and I want to share a couple of those with you. Former slave Reuben Waller joined the 10th Cavalry in 1867 to, quote, fight in the Indian Wars that were then raging in Kansas and Colorado. On the other hand, a man named Mazik Sanko, who was a Creole from New Orleans, joined the Army because of the possibility of education. He figured that by joining the service, he would get educational opportunities that would not be available to him in the private sector. And I might say, let me add parenthetically, that I think that was one of the major, if you will, one of the major factors, one of the major attractions of people, African Americans, who joined the Army, at least up until World War II. And of course, after the GI Bill, it would be a major attraction for all who joined the Army, because in a sense, the GI Bill was simply an extension of this area of this idea of joining the Army and gaining an education or gaining knowledge. There's another example, Private Charles Creek. I got tired of looking at mules in the face from sunrise to sunset. Actually, he should have said the other part of the anatomy of the mule. And he said, there must be a better way of living in the world. And of course, he eventually would join the US Army. But by the 20th century, by the early 20th century, the reasons for joining the Army would become far more complex because the Buffalo Soldiers had now become an institution. And African Americans were flocking to them precisely because of their reputation. Read the quote here. This is George Schuyler, who's, some of you may know him as a very famous columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier from the 1930s up until the 1960s. But before that, he was a Buffalo soldier at Fort Lawton and other places. And you can see, this is from the UW archives. These are Buffalo soldiers at Fort Lawton in 1900. This is just after they had returned from China. And what did they do in China? They put down, or they were part of the force that put down the Boxer Rebellion. Many of you are familiar with the Boxer Rebellion. Understand what's going on here. The Buffalo soldiers, and you're going to see examples of this throughout the West, but eventually after 1900, they're going to be used in the same capacity around the world. And, you know, we can fast forward to Iraq right now. That Buffalo soldiers would be the arm of the U.S. government. They would carry out policy. And regardless of how we feel about the policy, these Buffalo soldiers would be on the front lines, you know, making sure that that policy was instituted by the government of the United States. Notice Schuyler's approach here. He said, I never saw any colored person in any position of authority, and he goes on. And look at what he says. They talked of far-off places. Now, Buffalo soldiers couldn't say this in 1866 or 1867, but by 1900 they could. They talked of far-off places, the Philippines, Cuba, China, Mexico, and the Indian Territory. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. I guess they were just as exotic as somebody growing up in New York. But he talked of far-off places, and he says, in the Army, I could see the world that I wanted to see and have a chance to advance myself. Folks, this sounds almost like an Army recruiting poster today. Almost like what the Army says today. Let me give you an example, kind of a cross-section of the kinds of things that Buffalo soldiers did. I mean, we have this image of Buffalo soldiers fighting Indians, and certainly some of that took place, but let me show you the Buffalo soldiers were, as I said before, carrying out the policy of the federal government, and as such, they were going to be used in a variety of ways. For example, in the Battle of Tularosa, New Mexico, a group of Buffalo soldiers literally saved the town. I don't have enough time to get into it now, but Tularosa was a town of about 500 people. It was being attacked by a band of Apaches under Victorio. They assumed that they were going to be annihilated. We don't know that's the case. But black soldiers came in and literally rescued the town. And of course, one of the first blacks to gain, to be awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor, was the first sergeant who led the group of black soldiers into the town of Tularosa. I told this I gave this example at a presentation in San Angelo, Texas, thinking, okay, this is nice, this is a good example. At the end of the hour, a woman walked up with her granddaughter, an older woman with her granddaughter, and she said, my mother remembered those black soldiers saving the town. And I was moved by this. I mean, that here we have, I saw a living link to that particular story. We don't have a lot of examples of black soldiers saving towns, but certainly black soldiers were going to be engaged in activities that would result in the defense of populations. And that's how I come to my second example, defense of populations. In this instance, they defended the white settlers of Tularosa. And make what you will of this next example. In 1879, 10th Cavalry troops protected Kiowa women and children from Texas Rangers who were bound to try to kill them all. In other words, here are black soldiers saving Indians from attack by whites, by Texas Rangers. Let me give you a third example, 1881. In 1881, units of the 25th Infantry were called upon to provide disaster relief for 1,000 men, women, and children who had been forced out of their homes by a North Dakota flood. As far as we know, this is the first time the Army was used for disaster relief, and these, of course, were black soldiers who were engaged in this. All I could think of was Katrina. All I could think of was the hurricane in New Orleans last year. In other words, African-American soldiers were actually engaged in activities that were unlike anything that soldiers had normally done before. 1892, 1899, the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho. Some of you may know it, you've been through it, you've probably driven through it. It was one of the richest silver ore-producing areas in the world. It was also the center of a lot of mining activity, including union activity. Unions went out on strike in 1892 and in 1899. There was tremendous conflict between the unions and the mine owners, and the townspeople got caught in the middle of that conflict. Buffalo soldiers were sent in to try to maintain order. As a matter of fact, if you can see on the right, the upper right slide or image, this is it's a bad image, but it's an example of how will I say this, a corral, or better still, a concentration camp that Buffalo soldiers set up for striking miners. In other words, the soldiers rounded up hundreds, if not thousands, of striking miners and held them there. I will tell you, I have personal knowledge of this, that there are whites in northern Idaho who still resent Buffalo soldiers or black soldiers precisely because of that incident, those incidents in 1892 and 1899. I ran into that in the 1970s when I went up to do interviews. Let me give you some other examples. These are just other examples that are sort of evident. These on the lower right, these are Buffalo soldiers leading Sooners or white settlers out of the Indian Territory. They tried to get in illegally. That's why they were called Sooners, and leading them out. Here we have Buffalo soldiers guarding miners in New Mexico, Buffalo soldiers atop guarding stagecoaches. You know, these are the various activities. Sometimes, though, Buffalo soldiers got to do, or some Buffalo soldiers got to do interesting things. This is the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps in Yellowstone Park. I'll do this very quickly. Essentially, the Army came up in 1895 with this brilliant idea that they were going to replace the horse with the bicycle. Okay? Well, come on. I mean, you know, European armies were experimenting with this as well. I mean, this was all the rage in Germany and France. And so they decided, the Army in its infinite wisdom decided that they were going to use a group of Buffalo soldiers to test whether or not the bicycle was feasible. And so with one white officer, this unit of Buffalo soldiers set out from Fort Missoula, Montana, to St. Louis. They were going to ride all the way back there. Remember, there are no roads here, okay? This is 1896. And they were going to ride all the way back, and you can see them in Yellowstone Park. And there's a great quote here. One of the tourists encountered these cyclists as they rode through Yellowstone Park, and he asked them, "What's your destination? Where are you going?" And one soldier said, "The Lord only knows. We're just following the lieutenant." And, unfortunately for those Buffalo soldiers, I'm sure they had fun riding the bikes all the way back to St. Louis, but unfortunately for the Buffalo soldiers, the Army decided that replacing the horse with bikes wasn't practical at that moment. And as a result, the Buffalo soldiers' bicycle unit was quickly disbanded. Finally, in 1910, I'll use this as an example, and this is the best slide that we can get. In 1910, there were a series of forest fires, massive forest fires in northern Idaho and western Montana. To put it in perspective, they were the largest forest fires in the known or recorded history of the West and the nation up until that time. And only the fires, I think, in Colorado and in the early 2000s actually exceeded them. Buffalo soldiers were sent in to fight these forest fires. Now, they hadn't done this before. Nobody had done this kind of work before. And the Buffalo soldiers were sent in, and sometimes they were successful, often they were not. I mean, these were powerful fires that eventually killed 70 people and burned or destroyed, and I'll use the figure at that time, $1 billion in timber. And this is by 1910 figures, so you can imagine how much timber would be involved today. Buffalo soldiers did their job, but unfortunately their job was overwhelming. And it's very interesting because soon after that, the national parks, the U.S. government set up a group of professional firefighters in the West to fight these fires from this point on. But the first firefighters, the first people to fight fires in the West were these Buffalo soldiers. I throw this in. This is not part of the text, but I just threw it in because it would be fun. How many of you are familiar with Captain Abner Doubleday? Some of you are, okay. He is supposedly the inventor of baseball. There's been some dispute about that, but let's assume that that's correct for the purposes of this slide. Captain Doubleday, of course, was with the 10th Cavalry, and this is one of his units. And I didn't notice this until I actually took the slide. These are baseball bats in the foreground, and they're baseball gloves. He's teaching these guys. He's literally teaching these guys to play baseball. What better way to get knowledge of baseball than from the guy who supposedly invents baseball? But Doubleday is one of a number of examples of officers, white officers, who led black troops in the West during this entire period. Perhaps the most famous officer, white lieutenant, and eventually captain of black soldiers in the West was John J. Pershing. the head of the expeditionary forces in Europe later on, General Pershing. He had a tremendous regard. I can't get into a lot of this now, but he had a tremendous regard for African American soldiers at a time when very few of his fellow officers shared that regard. And yet, and I think that's a good segue into this next slide, not only did fellow officers have low regard for African American soldiers, but many of the townspeople, including, ironically, many of the townspeople who were defended by those black soldiers. You can see this editorial from the Las Cruces 34. And of course, as you can imagine, African American soldiers were going to have to deal with a threat that was wholly different from forest fires or floods or Native American warriors or the like. They were going to have to deal not just with white prejudice, but often white attack. That indeed, in a whole host of places, African American soldiers would be maligned. Again, I don't have time to get into all of this, but just think Brownsville, Texas, 1906, or think Houston, 1917, or think 100 different occasions in the West. And that's, again, part of what I call the tragic irony of the Buffalo Soldiers. These are men who are called upon to defend the very men, women, and children who in many instances are engaged in the maligning. Now, that's not to say that everyone in the West did so. There were thousands of whites who respected and admired the Buffalo Soldiers, but there were also thousands of other whites, and I would dare say more whites, who maligned the Buffalo Soldiers, who felt that they were useless, as the editorial had argued before. And therein lies the paradox. Therein lies the paradox. On one hand, these men are needed. They're needed to try to maintain the peace. They are needed to try to, quote, settle the frontier or to conquer the frontier. And indeed, as such, they have to act like men. They have to be afraid of absolutely no one and nothing. They have to, in effect, they have to embrace, in effect, a demeanor that would allow them to challenge any possibility, any danger that they would confront. And yet, somehow or another, they were supposed to turn that off when they came in contact with settled society. They were supposed to go back and be subservient again. And a lot of these people couldn't make the switch. And to be honest with you, they shouldn't have had to have made the switch. They shouldn't have had to have gone back and forth between the subservient role and that of real men, real soldiers in the United States Army. Obviously, Pershing, obviously any of the other leaders of the officers of the United States Army expected nothing less of the Buffalo Soldiers than to be the best possible fighting men. And yet they lived in an America where African American males were not supposed to be men. And that paradox would ultimately lead to tragedy, as in Brownsville in 1906 and in Houston in 1917. It would lead to calls for the disbandment of the Buffalo Soldiers in 1917, 1918, and it would lead to continued discrimination against Buffalo Soldiers and indeed all black soldiers until well into the Second World War. But it would also lead to black soldiers and others demanding their freedom. If Buffalo Soldiers could face down those who opposed them in the West, then why couldn't African Americans do the same thing in the rest of the country? And indeed, as Carter G. Woodson and others said, the Buffalo Soldiers inspired them to mount a campaign for full civil rights. We'll talk about that campaign. We'll talk about the efforts of blacks in the cities of the West next time we meet. Thank you.